Hi everyone, welcome to the final episode in this series of videos I'm doing about the exchange sacrifice. In this episode I wanted to talk about some other cases that I haven't discussed in the first two videos. The first one I wanted to look at I'm calling the disruptive sacrifice. So you might think of this as a sacrifice you play because you're forced to play it, because your position is going downhill and you need to do something. But basically the idea is you use an exchange sacrifice to change the flow of the game. And it can have offensive possibilities as well as defensive ones. It's not a purely defensive move. So this is an example taken from one of my games, actually. This was played in 2013 at my local chess club at this tournament. At this time, I was rated 1856 and my opponent's rating was 1991. So I'm facing a strong opponent, someone who's beaten me several times before, and he's got the white pieces and I have the black pieces. So he started off with e4, and by the way, I'm using one of my own examples here because I don't want to leave you with the impression that the exchange sacrifice is something just for experts and masters and top level players, but it can be a useful tool in your own games as well. Let's see. So it's I play the Sicilian, he played e4. I go with the Sicilian, he plays knight to c3, a very flexible move. It can introduce different systems. One of the systems it can introduce is the Grand Prix attack with f4. You see this more often at the amateur level than at the professional level, but it's a potentially dangerous system. And knight to c6 is the standard antidote to the Grand Prix attack. And this should be a good position for black. Well, let's go on. It's just not quite as flexible if you play the move d6 here, although I'm sure that's still playable. But my normal move is d6, but when I see this setup, I go with knight to c6. And he does continue with the Grand Prix attack with f4. I continue with g6. So I have a particular setup in mind. Let's see, he goes knight f3. I go bishop to g7, and he goes d3. d3 actually is a bit of a rare move. It's the normal moves here are bishop to b5 or bishop to c4. So putting the bishop on one of those two squares, and then pushing the pawn, I suppose. So white is deciding to just close the center, and maybe he has ideas of doing something with the bishop on the king side. And so we're not entirely out of the book, but it's a bit of a rare move. I play e6, and he continues with bishop e3. I'm going for a particular setup I have in mind with the knight here and these pawns. The idea is to clamp down on this f5 pawn push, which is a disruptive thing that white can do in the Grand Prix attack. It's not necessarily the best way to play, but it's playable. Let's see. He's attacking my pawn, though, so I have to defend it. He goes bishop to e2 now, just getting all his pieces developed. I continue, and we both castle. So he's set up for the attack, and I'm set up to defend against it. He takes a moment here to step aside with his king. I start some counterplay on the queen side with a6, or at least that's my idea. He stops it with a4. Then I decide to jump a knight into the center, knight to d4. And he doesn't, this is interesting, he doesn't want to trade off this knight. So he plays knight back to d2. So I go back to the queen side now with b6. I guess if he pushes a5, I want to have the ability to play b5 in response, not have that pawn be permanently backwards. And also I'm giving my bishop a good diagonal. It actually might have been better to play b6 the move before, but anyway, we're amateurs. We're not playing the best moves necessarily. So he goes bishop f3 here, which is a very interesting way to play. He's just offering to give up this bishop for the knight. It's locked in behind the pawn chain, and he's going to just trade off this pair of minor pieces and then attack on the king side with the remaining pieces. Let's see, I play rook to b8. I want to get the rook off that diagonal and get the bishop here, and I wasn't sure yet if I wanted to take that bishop or not. I was still thinking about it. White kind of forces the issue with knight to e2, and now I have to decide if I want to retreat the knight, let him take it. Actually, if he takes it, he wins a pawn. Does he? No, I'm sorry, that's defended. So yeah, so I have the option of letting him take the knight or choosing to take his knight or his bishop. And I decided eventually it was better to take the bishop. And he plays rook takes f3, showing his aggressive intent. Not taking back with the knight, but taking back with the rook so he can swing it over here to one of these sides and just attack. And my opponent is a strong attacking player. I've fallen victim to these attacks before. I have to say the chess engine is not really impressed with white's play. It thinks that black is better. But to face this in an over-the-board game, it can be a bit tricky. But I continue here with bishop to b7, putting this bishop on a good diagonal and finishing my development. Actually, to show how unconcerned the chess engine is, it actually thinks my best move here is to just take that pawn, and then I'm just up material. So it's not worried about the king side at all. Anyway, bishop b7 is what I played, and black is still slightly better in the computer estimation here in this point. White took a moment to play c3 and block my bishop, also stopping me perhaps from getting a piece on this square. And I continue with d5. So I'm just trying to activate my bishop and do something in the center. And he sort of ignores my plan and just goes directly for the attack with rook h3. So I play queen c7. He goes queen e1. So the queen is the typical maneuver coming over like this. It needs to get onto a diagonal where it can reach the squares on the king side. Let's see. So I go ahead and take here. And he plays queen h4 immediately. This is a tempo move. He is threatening checkmate in one. But I had seen that and planned to play h6 here, and I'm holding him off for the moment. And then he has time to take back, which he takes back with the pawn. Then I decide to play the move f5. I'm still playing with the idea of activating this bishop. He kind of stopped my queenside counterplay, but I'm going to use the bishop and queen over here on the queen side to get counterplay against his king. So I continue with the move f5 here, and he plays e5. So that diagonal is open, but the center is closed, so I can't, I have no further pawn breaks in the center. The remaining pawn breaks actually seem to belong to white. He has this pawn break. I suppose on a good day I could play a pawn break like that, but that looks like a recipe for disaster in the current situation with my weakened king. So I bring my knight into the game this way, going to d5, trying to activate it. He goes with knight to c4. And here I realize something about his plan. He's looking to bring the knight into this square. And from that square, maybe it'll trade off against the bishop and eliminate my counterplay on this diagonal. But also it's looking at these squares on the king side. So a long-term plan could be with the knight here to push this pawn forward to weaken the point on f5, maybe bring this knight in and sacrifice on f5 and get a knight there at the end. Anyway, it starts to look like a dangerous attack to me. That's what I was thinking. And I played the move rook b to d8 with the intent of trading off that knight if it became troublesome. And he hopped a knight in there right away, and I took it immediately. So surprisingly to me afterwards when I looked at this, this was the top engine choice. The engine wants to immediately sacrifice the exchange. I was first thinking about waiting a bit. You know, I could save my bishop by dropping it back here. But it seems like taking right away is the right answer, and I decided, well, why should I be wasting time and giving him more tempo moves here in his attack against my king? So so I just took it right away, and of course he has to take back. So I do get a pawn for the exchange, and I also have the bishop pair. So just from a material point of view, as I was saying in the previous video, you can consider that an equal trade. It's not like I've actually given up material here. I have sufficient material compensation. The question is, do I have anything else? And actually, the chess engine likes this position for black. When I get rid of this knight here, there's a lot less force the knight that was on the d6 square. When I get rid of that knight, there's one less piece to participate in the attack over here, and that makes my king actually quite a bit safer, and it allows me to get going with my counterplay. So it turns out to be a good move from that point of view. And so this is what I meant by a disruptive exchange sacrifice. I didn't like the flow of the game, and I'm giving up the exchange here in order to change what's going on. So it's disrupting his attack and trying to get things going for me. And it had a psychological effect actually too, because I played that move rather quickly. He dropped the knight there, and then I just kind of snapped it off because I had calculated that out in advance that that's what I was going to do. And so it kind of threw him off his stride here. He paused to think for a minute, and not seeing any way to continue on the king side, and maybe starting to worry about pressure here. I mean, my queen just has to go here, and I've got a nice battery there. He dropped his queen back to f2. And, well, maybe he wants to bring his knight in, and he's trying to figure out the right arrangement of pieces. Hard to say. But anyway, it had the desired effect of squashing his attack. And now that he's played like this rook is looking a bit out of play. It doesn't really have a role here. So that's another thing I got out of the exchange sacrifice, and that's why black is better in this position. So anyway, let's see. He played queen f2. I went knight back to f6, opening up this diagonal and maybe bringing the knight out to one of these squares on the king side here in middle. He went knight to g1, and I went knight to g4, hitting his queen and solidly defending this pawn here. Got an extra piece defending it now, and tempo on the queen. I wasn't sure if I wanted to take this bishop or not. It's at the moment blocked in behind a pawn, so it didn't seem so important to take it. So he moved his queen to e2, and I pushed forward with e5. So I thought maybe I could try and disrupt things here, although I am opening up the diagonal for his bishop. Let's see, he played rook to f1, and I went rook to e8. So that's my idea, opening up the e-file in the center here, and getting some play on this file. So he moved his queen over to d2, offering the trade, and I stepped aside. I didn't want the queen trade. Went to c7 here. Wanted to keep an eye on this diagonal. I guess I didn't feel like putting the queen on this square and giving up the control of these squares. Let's see. Actually, the chess engine, though, I have to say, thinks that I should take. Thinks that black is much better after the queen trade. So queen takes, bishop takes, rook to d8 hits the bishop. And it's not good to defend with the knight because I can kick the knight away with the pawn push, so the bishop has to move somewhere, and then I can play rook to d1 if the bishop goes there. And I guess there's, I don't know, maybe it's not so great to put it on c1. I'm not sure. Anyway, this was the computer line, and it looks like white is just all tied up here. So that was a valid way to continue and best play for both sides, apparently. Anyway, I was avoiding the queen trade with the idea that, now that I'm down the exchange, I want to stay in the middle game here and keep things complicated. So I wasn't looking for queen trades at that point. Let's see. He went rook g3, maybe thinking of giving the exchange back. At least that's what I thought. But he actually had a different idea. Let's see. I played king h7 to get my king out of the line of fire. It was a bit open on this diagonal here. And he played h3 to kick my knight. That was his idea, getting the rook out of the way to hit the knight. The knight drops back to f6. But I guess I should show one more chance. Actually, this is a place where the chess engine is recommending that he should just take here. Now, this is adequately defended over here. I've got the king, the rook, the bishop, and the knight. Even if the knight gets chased away, I've got two defenders over here. But this pawn is a bit annoying. The computer gives this line: bishop takes, and then giving up the exchange, either before or after playing Another line is to put the bishop here first and provoke a lot of trades and then give up the exchange. So, or give the exchange back. But that's how the computer wants to play this. And in this particular line, after bishop takes h6, I can play bishop takes h2. The computer still thinks black is better here, but it's a messy position. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, he didn't play that way. He played h3, holding on to his extra material. I drop my knight back. And from here on out, actually, black is just winning. It's kind of interesting. Let's see. He maneuvered his rook here. Yeah, I guess this is why I'm winning from here on out. This rook has no good moves. So it's kind of funny. Even though white has that extra material, he can't find a use for it. Wherever that rook goes, it gets taken. So he decided to just give up the exchange here. So that's why it probably would have been better to give up the exchange earlier and just take that knight. But now I'm actually material up. And the game continued like this. I'll just play through the rest of the game so you can see how it ended. The rook dropped back, queen to c6, putting the queen on this diagonal, looking towards his king, also looking towards the queen side. Let's see, he played b4, went rook to e7. Yeah, I guess I wanted to defend along the 7th rank there, although his queen could penetrate down to the 8th rank. He went queen to a2, coming over here to defend. I went knight to d5, hitting the bishop. Queen went back to f2 to defend over there. Then I went ahead and started grabbing material here. These pawns are hanging. I took here. And, I took the bishop off at this point. And then took here, defending my bishop. So I've just gained another pawn, and so now I'm up 2 pawns, and I'm no longer down the exchange ever since he gave it back. Let's see, he went queen e2 here. Now white is the one that wants to keep the material on and try and fight for a draw that way. Went queen a5, attacking this pawn. He went rook to c1, attacking the bishop. Dropped the bishop back to d4. He played rook to c8, so he penetrates with the rook. But I just took the pawn, so defends my bishop. The bishop is defending here. And he just resigned at this point. I'm 3 pawns up, and I have a clear plan. I'm just pushing this pair of pawns through. And, my rook on the back rank is doing a good enough job of defending that, combined with the bishop. So it's going to be very hard for him to get any counterplay in this position. So that's how I won the game. And I think it's a good example of using that exchange sacrifice to change the flow of the game, and also an example of how just regular players can use it. Okay, let's take a look at the next example. The next game I wanted to show you was played in Dortmund in 2017 between Vladimir Kramnik and Matthias Bluebaum, a couple of strong masters, and of course Kramnik, former world champion. Kramnik plays his favorite reti setup with knight to f3, d5, g3, bishop g4. It's all pretty standard. Bishop g2, e6. e6 is a bit of a rare move. The most common move here is c6, setting up a strong bulwark against that bishop on g2. But I'm sure Matthias knows what he's doing here. He plays e6, Kramnik castles, knight f6, and d3. I'm going to go through the opening pretty quickly to get to the interesting parts with the exchange sacrifice. So bishop e7, I mean, it all looks pretty normal anyway. h3, kicking the bishop. Bishop drops back. c4. Yeah, I have played the reti occasionally, and this is often an idea. The bishop here looking at this diagonal and this pawn on c4 ready to undermine the center. Black shores up the center now with c6. Queen b3 looking at the b pawn, and the queen goes over to c8 to defend. And now a kind of controversial move from Kramnik, but apparently good. g4. I looked at this with the chess engine, and it was one of the top choices here. Looks a bit counterintuitive to me. White is not completely developed. The queen side is undeveloped here, and he's starting active play on the king side. But his king side position is pretty good, and black is not castled or completely developed either. So both sides need to finish their development here, and it seems like it's white can get away with this move. Bishop to g6. Now an exchange on the center here, and bishop to f4. So now completing development. But even after the development is completed, white is going to be left with this weakness that black can go after. And we'll see that happening in the game. Knight to c6, knight to c3, castle. So both sides finally completing their development, getting castled, getting their pieces out. Rook to c1, queen to d7, and knight to e5. So starting a knight maneuver, but really just provoking a trade. The knight takes, bishop takes. And now black decides to put the question to this pawn here and plays the move h5. So there's an immediate threat to win that pawn, and because the knight is on it. But more than that, it's opening up white's king side when white is maybe not ready to deal with that yet. So white pushes on with g5. I'm sure this was all part of the plan. And now this knight does not have a great square. Notice that these squares are covered by pawns. The square is his own pawn is there. So he has a choice of going back to h7, which would lock in this bishop here, or going back to e8, where he might route around to the center. He chose to go to e8. And Kramnik plays f4 now. That also, this pawn was under fire immediately after the knight move, so he had to defend it. Now this bishop moves. It's looking at the pawn there. I guess decided it wasn't doing much. So he moves here and plays check. d4 blocks. The bishop drops back to d6. Oh, I'm sorry, does not offer a trade. Drops back to b6. And it's on this diagonal here with a pin on that pawn. So this Kramnik will have to be careful about this bishop here becoming loose at certain times. Anyway, at this point, Kramnik comes up with a plan. And this is where he starts to set up his exchange sacrifice. So if you want to, you can think about this position with that bit of a clue. See if you could figure out how white would play here. Okay, I'm going to give the answer away now. Pause the video if you want time to think about it. But Kramnik's plan starts with the move f5. And both these moves, I also checked them out with the chess engine, and it likes them. So pushing that pawn forward. And I suppose, oh yeah, if white takes with the pawn, then this is hanging. The d-pawn is hanging. So that's one of the points of this move. So he takes with the bishop. And that's where you give up the exchange, because after that, after the pawn takes back, this pawn is still hanging. So what can you say about this exchange? Sacrifice. This exchange sacrifice is another one where the material is actually pretty even. This white got a pawn for the exchange, and white also got the bishop pair. So from a material point of view, you could say white is just even. And the chess engine agrees with that. It gives white a slight edge, but no more than the typical opening advantage that white has. So it's not like white is immediately winning. But what's interesting is that with this configuration of pieces, you can play on in the middle game for a long time. And that's what happens. So queen e6. The bishop doesn't have to move, and the knight doesn't have to move yet. Kramnik takes a moment to put his king on a safer square, getting it away. Oh yeah, the bishop was under threat. That's right, there was that pin there. So the bishop was hanging. So one point of getting rid of the light squared bishop is these light squares are relatively safe for the king. So having weakened some squares around his king, he gets rid of that bishop and gives his king some aid, because now he's got this light squared bishop that can patrol the light squares, and black doesn't have a counterpart for that. And black's extra piece, the extra rook that he has because he won the exchange, is sitting over here not doing anything, which is often the case immediately after a sacrifice in the middle game. Anyway, Matthias gets his rook into the game with rook to d8. The queen runs over to f3, I guess not wanting to move the knight immediately and allow a queen trade. which probably is what black should go for. Black should go for the endgame in this position, try to simplify things and get into an endgame position where the rook will be stronger than the minor piece. Let's see. G6 was played here, shoring up the pawn structure around the king. E3, shoring up the pawn structure in the center, defending this pawn. An extra defender for that pawn. King goes to H7. Now the knight hops into F4, so Kramnik is, having solidified the center, is now refocusing his attention on the king side. Queen goes to E7 here. And the queen goes to G3. Actually, the chess engine here, once again, is materialistically wanting to grab a pawn, and thinks white is a little better here. But probably black would feel fine about playing this position too. Probably black's drawing chances are pretty good there. But that's the chess engine's preferred move. Kramnik is keeping the material on, playing queen G3. Bishop goes to C7, offering another trade. And here's where we get the second exchange sacrifice. So this is, you could argue whether this is really an exchange sacrifice or not, because immediately after rook takes, after knight takes, there's bishop F6, which would win the exchange back if Kramnik chose to take it. I guess after rook takes bishop, maybe he could have considered taking with the queen if he really wanted to. Oh, no, he can't because the bishop is on it, of course. Has to take with the knight. Yeah, so you could argue this isn't really an exchange sacrifice because Kramnik can get the exchange back immediately. And he does play this move. But after the queen moves, the queen runs out to B4 looking for some counterplay. Maybe coming in here, maybe coming in. Well, that's covered, but maybe after taking there, coming down to the first rank. Kramnik doesn't grab the rook, but just continues with the attack. In fact, he comes up with a great sacrifice here. So you could think of that second exchange sack as more of a tactical exchange sack, trying to get rid of some defenders, but more importantly, to preserve this key bishop, and we'll see the role it plays later in the game. So the great sacrifice is this one, knight takes H5. And in fact, the chess engine is recommending that black refuse the sacrifice and drop this knight to E8. And thinks this is about even. But, well, it's still a complicated position. Who knows what would happen here. But, well, this is hanging. And the knight is threatening to take off the bishop there. Although if this knight gets in here with check and the queen gets here, that looks pretty dangerous too. So I have no idea what would happen from this position forward, but just the chess engine thinks that's the best way to play. Anyway, Matthias took the knight, said, show me what you've got, and Kramnik pushed on with G6. That was the idea of that sacrifice, opening up the G file for a pawn push, and the king ran to G8. So notice that there's not too many choices. He could come forward, I suppose. But the main point is that if f takes G8, then queen takes C7. Not only gets some material back, although he's still down 2 exchanges, but it's a forced mate. There's no coordination of these pieces on the second rank, or 7th rank. So the queen can just gobble them up. Even the queen, they're all looking at different squares on the 7th rank. So total lack of coordination, and wherever the king moves, it gets mated. So anyway, that's just a forced mate. So he can't take the pawn. He went king back to G8, probably a more sensible choice than bringing it forward to H6. I didn't check to see if there was a mate there, but I wouldn't be surprised. Let's see. The queen comes forward to G5. Oh yeah, the queen comes onto G5 with check, so that would be strong. And now here's where Matthias makes his last mistake. Apparently queen to H6 here. Not queen H6. What's the move? Knight D5. Knight D5 here apparently defends. So white would continue with just grabbing the material at this point. And after queen D6, take here with check. king takes, take here with check, king goes back, and then, oh, king g7 was given as the better move. And then bishop here. And let's see, at this point, white is still down the exchange. It's just down one exchange and has 2 pawns for the exchange. So materially slightly better for white with the bishop pair and 2 pawns for the exchange. And the chess engine gives white a slight advantage, but not necessarily a clear win. So certainly a game that could be played. Let's see, let's back up. There's one point I had a question about. Oh yeah, what about queen h6 immediately here? That's kind of the idea, threatening mate. Ah, the knight takes the bishop. So that's why knight d5 prevents the immediate mate. Anyway, Matthias had a different idea. I think he saw a perpetual or maybe a way to defend. He played the move h4, but it just doesn't work. So Kramnik goes with queen h6 now, threatening the mate. And Matthias plays queen e1 check. King has one move, it goes here. Queen goes here, check. King steps back to g1. Queen goes here, check, and maybe he was thinking this is a perpetual, but Kramnik played the move bishop to f1, and black resigned. There's no stopping the forced mate. And well, it's a key point. There's actually 2 mate threats here, because one thing that black could try in this position is queen g3 check, and then grab the pawn, because that defends against the mate here, but it doesn't defend against that mate. so that doesn't help. And then the other thing after this move, this is where black resigned. The other thing he could try, I mean, this is the only check here. This pawn is protected by the queen. So this is the only check. King here. There's another check here. If he's not going to play that queen takes g3, he has to keep checking. But bishop d2, and we're almost out of checks. Queen d1 is the last check after the king goes to h2. There's not another check there, so it's just all over in this position. So anyway, let's go back up to the end of the game here. It was right here. Yeah, queen e1 check and bishop to f1. And then black resigned. So interesting game, and I have one more example I wanted to show you. This last game I wanted to show you was a game between Gideon Stahlberg and Laszlo Szabo. Gideon Stahlberg with the white pieces and Laszlo Szabo with the black pieces. There are a couple of players that I learned about when I was doing that series on the 1953 Candidates Tournament in Zurich, and I covered quite a few of their games in that tournament, and it's nice to find another one here where they face each other. This started out as a King's Indian defense. Oh, I wanted to add, this was played in Kameri in Latvia. That's a Latvian resort town, or was a resort town at the time. And it was played in March of 1939, so it's 6 months before the start of World War II. So getting in their chess before the war started. Anyway, I'm just going to go straight to the tactical position that I wanted to show you, where the sacrifices start to happen. But I did want to mention it started out as a King's Indian defense, which the grandmasters at the time were starting to experiment with. It was still a pretty novel opening at that time. In this position, the material is actually even, although white is about to win a pawn. Black has a better pawn structure and has the bishop pair, but his king is not castled, and the rooks are not connected. So black needs another move to finish getting his house in order, and white's pieces are all pretty active. So this actually is an okay position for white, even though white's pawn structure is a complete disaster. and also with these open lines, it should be good for the side with the bishop pair. But well, to start with, white can win a pawn, and he does. So the idea is a simple one, that if pawn takes bishop, then rook takes bishop, and so there's no particular point in taking that bishop. Instead, Laszlo Szabo goes with the king to e7, connecting his rooks. And now the bishop goes to b5. And this is the exchange sacrifice. It's actually a bit of a trap in a way, because to grab the exchange sacrifice, black plays here. But this position turns out to be good for white. So I don't know how far ahead Gideon had calculated, but at the very least it shows good judgment in allowing this, because this is an exchange sacrifice because the rook has nowhere to go. And if it drops back, then this bishop is hanging. So that would just lose a piece. So the only answer that white has here is to give up the exchange by taking the bishop. But let's back up a second. Looking at this with the chess engine says that that black's best response here is just to develop the rook. Bring the rook out. Don't grab the exchange. And this is about an even position. Even though black is down the pawn, he has a better pawn structure and he has the bishop pair. So should be okay for black as long as his pieces can be brought out. But, well, maybe Szabo was thinking he could win the exchange and have a material edge and go on to win the game. So anyway, he went for it with bishop d6, and Gideon played this move, taking the, I'm sorry, didn't take that way, he took this way, and allowed black to grab the exchange like this. And now there's two bishops hanging. This bishop is hanging and this bishop is hanging, but white is down the exchange. But white has an intermediate check here. So he goes ahead and throws that in, drives the king back, and now we see maybe some of the problems. If you calculate ahead this far, you might start to realize that actually this is not a bad position for white, even if white is down the exchange, because the king is cut off, and this is a pretty active rook on the 7th rank. Now, it's not a permanent situation. It's not a bind, because this rook is going to be able to snake out one way or another. But it does give some time to white to play actively here. So anyway, after the check, the king went back. We still have to resolve the situation with the hanging bishops. So Gideon takes here, Laszlo takes, and now this pawn is supporting the knight. The knight also is preventing this rook from getting into the game as well. But let's see, it was, whose move was that? Yeah, that was, yeah, black just took the knight, so b4 was played. And we can see another idea here. These pawns are going to create a passed pawn over here, and that's going to be dangerous in the endgame. But this is an endgame position now, so this is a good example of how being down the exchange can also be okay in the endgame. You know, it depends on the particular circumstances. The fact that this rook is still out of play is a big part, and white is going to exploit that to grab pawns. He's not able to keep the rook out of play forever, but he can rack up some more material here. So anyway, the king went to e8 to chase the rook. The rook went to c7 to grab a pawn, and now this rook comes over to f8 to get into the game. Rook to c7 was played, and now rook to b7, covering the second rank and preparing to defend. I guess the king could have been checked back. I was just wondering why the king didn't come up to defend, but I guess it could be checked back again. Anyway, so I played like this. Rook takes e6 was played. Now rook to e7 to defend. That was the idea of lifting that rook. This rook comes back to c6 and grabbing a pawn here, so not falling too far behind the material. But these passed pawns are dangerous. He is looking at this b pawn here. But first, rook to c8 check was played. King goes to f7. Has to keep in touch with the rook because that can get exchanged off. And now c6. So not bothering to defend this pawn, but just pushing this pawn forward. Rook to e7 was played, and then knight to d5, and black resigned because now if the rook can't grab this pawn is going to come forward, and there will be a killer pawn duo. And of course the rook can't go to this square or this square because these are all covered. It's going to be very difficult. If the rook keeps dropping back, then the pawn, and then white gets to form the pawn duo and push those pawns through. So completely winning for white. and the kind of in-game position if you can get to. It's okay to be down the exchange in this kind of hit game. So I wanted to wrap things up by encouraging you to play these exchange sacrifices when you get the chance. So remember, if you can get a pawn for the exchange and some other compensation like a bishop pair or active pieces or a weakened king position, that's often good enough, particularly if you can keep your opponent's rooks out of the game or keep them out for a long time while your pieces are active. You can use that time advantage you have to rack up some more material gains before his rooks manage to get into the game. So when you're playing and you're down the exchange, you want to stay active with your pieces. You don't need to get radical. You don't necessarily need to go for the attack unless you see a winning attack, but just play actively with your pieces and try and exploit the fact that your minor pieces are easier to maneuver in the middle game, in a crowded middle game, than rooks are. And on the other hand, if you have lost the exchange, your opponent has sacrificed the exchange against you, your goal is to try and get your extra material into the game. So you have to find a way to activate those rooks. Sometimes it involves exchanging into an endgame where the rooks can be active, but sometimes they can be active in the middle game. You just need to find good squares for them, good posts, open lines that they can operate on, and that's how you can fight against this. But either way, I recommend trying this and getting some experience with it. And as you gain experience with these positions, playing for and against the exchange sacrifice, you'll have better ideas of what to do. Okay, that's it for this video and this series of videos about the exchange sacrifice. Stay tuned for my top 10 middle game idea number 8, pawn breaks, and I will see you then. Bye.